The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, a place where gossip travels as quickly as the gentle breeze, was unusually quiet that morning. Leonard Strickland, a man of few words, had always been the steady presence in the village quiet, reserved and seemingly content with his solitary existence. But today, the stillness of the village carried a weight he could not escape. He stood by his window, staring out at the familiar cobbled streets, his mind drifting over the mundane tasks of the day until the doorbell rang. It was the local constable, his face pale and drawn. "Mr. Strickland, I'm afraid I have some bad news," he began, his voice faltering. Leonard's heart sank before the words even left the constable's lips. "Your mother, Mrs. Strickland, she's been found dead in her home." At first glance, it seemed like any other death in the village. Mrs. Strickland, the once vibrant matriarch of the family, had reached her late 80s, and in a place where time was often measured by seasons, not years. Her passing seemed like a natural part of the rhythm of life. Yet, as Leonard stood there, staring at the constable's face, something gnawed at him. It wasn't the news itself, it was the way it felt wrong. An uneasy weight, like a wrong note in a symphony, hung in the air. He left his home in a daze, his mind clouded with confusion, fear, and a strange sense of dread. As he walked down the cobbled path to his mother's house, every step felt heavier than the last. Upon reaching the doorstep, the air around him seemed different, thicker, more oppressive. The door was slightly ajar, an unusual sight. Mrs. Strickland had always been particular about keeping her house in order, and even more so when it came to locking doors. Inside, the atmosphere was eerily quiet. The grand fireplace in the living room was cold, the hearth untouched. Everything was in its place, yet the silence was unnatural. As Leonard walked further into the house, a chill ran down his spine. The room was impeccably arranged, the way his mother had always liked it. Yet there was something off. A chair was slightly askew, as if someone had just risen from it hastily. A faint smell of something metallic lingered in the air. And then on the table near the window lay a glass of water, still half full, as though Mrs. Strickland had been interrupted before finishing her drink. The moment Leonard stepped into the room, his heart skipped a beat. There, on the floor, beneath the window, lay his mother. Her body, once so full of life, was now cold and still. Her eyes were wide open, but they were not the eyes of a peaceful woman slipping into death's embrace. No, they were filled with an unmistakable fear, as though something or someone had taken her by surprise. Her eyes were wide open, but they were not the eyes of a peaceful woman slipping into death's embrace. No, they were filled with an unmistakable fear, as though something or someone had taken her by surprise. But it wasn't just the fear in her eyes that unsettled Leonard. It was the faintest trace of a smile on her lips, as if she knew something he didn't, something that, even in death, she couldn't take with her. The constable, still standing at the doorway, stepped inside and looked down at the body. He muttered a few words about the cause of death, natural, likely. But Leonard's mind raced. This was not how a death should feel. Not his mother. Not like this. As he stood frozen in place, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door creaking open in the hallway. And then, with the slightest of noises, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Miss Marple, small, sharp-eyed, and with that familiar, unassuming air of quiet authority that only a true detective could possess. She surveyed the room, her gaze flicking from the body to the faintly disturbed chair, to the glass of water, and then back to Leonard. Her expression was calm, unreadable, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She had already seen it, what Leonard was only beginning to realize. Without a word, Miss Marple stepped closer to Mrs. Strickland's body, kneeling down beside her with an ease that came only from years of experience. She studied the scene, her fingers brushing the edge of the chair, and then gliding over the glass of water. She paused, staring at the slightly askew chair for a moment longer than anyone would have expected. Then, she turned her gaze back to Leonard, her eyes sharp and probing. "Mr. Strickland," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of certainty. "I believe we are dealing with more than just a natural death here. Leonard's pulse quickened as Miss Marple's words hung in the air, a quiet challenge to the simple explanation everyone had expected. What had truly happened in this room? Who had been involved? And why did Leonard feel as though he was standing on the edge of something much darker than he had ever imagined? Before Leonard could speak, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the faintest of details. The window was open just a crack, allowing a small breeze to stir the curtains. The subtle movement felt deliberate. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew. This was not the work of chance. This was something more deliberate, something carefully orchestrated. The door closed softly behind them, and the weight of the mystery settled over the room like a heavy fog. Cliffhanger ending. Just as Miss Marple began to move closer to a cluttered desk in the corner of the room, a sudden noise echoed from upstairs, a sharp thud, like something heavy falling. Miss Marple froze, her keen eyes narrowing. Without a word, she turned to Leonard, a look of quiet urgency flashing in her gaze. "Stay here," she instructed, her voice low but firm. Leonard nodded, but his heart raced as she moved swiftly toward the stairs. A cold, unsettling silence filled the room once more. Then, as the creak of the staircase seemed to grow louder, the door behind Leonard, already ajar, slammed shut with a force that rattled the house. Miss Marple's steps grew fainter, and for a moment, Leonard was left in the chilling quiet, grappling with a growing realization. The answers he sought were now slipping further out of reach. And as the weight of the mystery hung over him, a single question swirled in his mind: was it already too late to uncover the truth? The door behind him opened once more, but this time it wasn't Miss Marple who stepped through. The investigation begins. The sun had barely risen over St. Mary Mead, but the air inside Mrs. Strickland's house felt as cold as winter, despite the warm glow of the early morning light. Miss Marple, standing by the door, looked around, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the most mundane of moments. The house, once brimming with life and laughter, now felt hollow, like an old book gathering dust on a forgotten shelf. Leonard sat near the fireplace, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his face ashen. He was, on the surface, the picture of grief, a son mourning his lost mother, but Miss Marple's practiced eyes caught the subtle stiffness in his posture, the slight tremor in his jaw. It was as if the very grief he was supposed to be feeling was being forced upon him, as if he were playing a part in a tragedy he hadn't fully come to terms with. And that, Miss Marple knew, was often the sign of something more sinister. The housekeeper, Mrs. Burroughs, a woman in her late 50s with a stern expression, stood by the window, wringing her hands nervously. Her eyes were constantly darting to Leonard, as if she were expecting him to explode at any moment. But he didn't. He just sat there, the picture of detached sorrow. Miss Marple spoke first, her voice soft, but cutting through the thick silence like a blade. "Tell me, Mrs. Burroughs, how was Mrs. Strickland in her final days?" Mrs. Burroughs stiffened, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her apron. She hesitated for just a moment too long before answering. "She was a little more frail, Miss Marple, but still sharp, always sharp with her words." Miss Marple nodded. "Sharp, you say? In what way?" The housekeeper shifted uncomfortably. "Well, she could be cutting sometimes, especially with those she didn't quite like. She had a way of making enemies, you see. Not that she ever showed it outright, but I've seen it." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Who would those enemies be, Mrs. Burroughs?" But before Mrs. Burroughs could respond, the door creaked open, and Dr. Prescott, the local doctor, entered the room. He was a man in his late 40s, with thinning hair and a face that seemed perpetually stuck between a frown and a grimace. He had been Mrs. Strickland's physician for years, and yet there was something about his demeanor now that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. He was acting too hurried, too eager to brush aside the tragedy as just another inevitable part of life. "Miss Marple," he said, offering a stiff nod. "What are you doing here? Surely you know that this is a natural death. Old age, nothing more." He spoke with the confidence of someone who had seen enough to know the truth. Yet, his eyes avoided meeting hers, darting toward Leonard, and then back to the door. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him for a moment, sharp as ever. "You're certain, Dr. Prescott? Number no lingering questions, no doubts." Her voice was gentle, but there was an underlying force that made the doctor shift uncomfortably on his feet. Dr. Prescott's lips tightened, and he cleared his throat. "Of course, Miss Marple. What else could there be?" But Miss Marple was already moving, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. She turned to Leonard, whose quiet sobs now seemed rehearsed, like a play he had been forced to act in. There was something about him, something off. She had seen it before. It was the look of a man trying to bury something he didn't want anyone to know. "Mr. Strickland," she said, her voice gentle but laced with an undeniable authority, "tell me about your relationship with your mother. How was she in her last days?" Leonard's eyes flickered briefly, before his gaze hardened. We weren't as close as we should have been," he said, his voice low. "But she was my mother. And I loved her. Of course I did." His words were calm, but they felt like a performance-rehearsed script he was reading from. Miss Marple said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. Leonard's eyes darted nervously toward the mantelpiece, as if seeking an escape from the conversation. Miss Marple had seen it before, those little tells, the way people hid the truth by lying just enough to make it sound plausible. As the housekeeper and Dr. Prescott grew silent, Miss Marple continued her questioning, asking about the people closest to Mrs. Strickland, villagers who had ties to her, some for years, others only recently. It was clear that the late Mrs. Strickland wasn't as beloved as her son seemed to think. There were whispers of secrets long buried, old betrayals, and grudges that had never been spoken of, but lingered in the shadows like ghosts. One by one, the villagers spoke half-truths and silences that made the air feel thicker, heavier with suspicion. The widow who lived next door spoke of a dispute between Mrs. Strickland and her late husband, a disagreement over property that had never been resolved. The grocer mentioned how Mrs. Strickland had accused him of cheating her, only to later apologize, though the apology had never quite felt genuine. And the vicar, a man Miss Marple had always found to be a little too eager to forgive, hinted at a wrongdoing Mrs. Strickland had committed years ago, though he never went into detail. It became clear to Miss Marple that Mrs. Strickland's life was not as simple as Leonard wanted to believe. There were hidden stories, dark corners that hadn't been swept clean. And one of these secrets, she suspected, had something to do with her death. But what? As the morning sun poured in through the windows, Miss Marple stood, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together in her mind. She had gathered more than enough to know that Mrs. Strickland's death was no accident. But who would go to such lengths to hide the truth? The door clicked softly behind her as she stepped out, leaving behind a room full of unanswered questions. The investigation was just beginning. And already Miss Marple knew that the truth would not be easy to uncover. Cliffhanger ending. As Miss Marple turned to leave, her eyes fell upon a small, inconspicuous drawer in the corner of the room. It had been left slightly ajar. There, tucked inside, was a letter yellowed with age, the ink barely legible. She reached for it, a chill running down her spine. There, in Mrs. Strickland's unmistakable handwriting, were words that would change everything. "I know what you did. If anything happens to me, it will be your doing." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Who had Mrs. Strickland been threatening? And more importantly, was it the same person who had ended her life? The suspects. Twists start. The village of St. Mary Mead was as quiet as ever, but the air in Mrs. Strickland's house seemed to hum with an unspoken tension that Miss Marple couldn't ignore. Every corner of the house seemed to hold secrets, and every person Miss Marple spoke with raised more questions than answers. Leonard Strickland's reaction to his mother's death remained unsettling. As the days passed, his grief seemed to deepen only in the most superficial ways. He carried the air of a man burdened by responsibility, but not by genuine sorrow. When asked about the time he had spent with his mother, Leonard's responses were terse. His tone cold, nothing like the heartfelt mourning one might expect from a son who had just lost his mother. It was as if he were merely going through the motions. Miss Marple observed him closely, noting his distracted gaze and the nervous way he would clench his hands when someone mentioned Mrs. Strickland's name. Was his stoic behavior a mask for something darker? Or was it possible that their relationship wasn't as innocent as it seemed? She decided to speak with Mrs. Burrows, the housekeeper, hoping that perhaps she knew more about Leonard's behavior than she let on. Mrs. Burrows was a woman of few words, but Miss Marple's presence had a way of making people open up, even the most reticent. "Well, Miss Marple, I can tell you this about Mrs. Strickland," Mrs. Burrows began, her voice low, almost as if speaking the words aloud might somehow summon the past. She had a way of holding on to things, old grudges especially. She never let go of a slight. And she was sharp with her tongue, Miss Marple. I remember her telling Leonard off many times, though he was always so quiet. So very quiet. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Telling him off? What do you mean?" The housekeeper hesitated before continuing. She had a knack for stirring trouble between people. Little things, comments here and there, hints at past mistakes. Sometimes, I think she did it on purpose, just to see what would happen. Leonard. Well, I always thought he was more of a listener than a talker, but something in his eyes told me he was growing tired of her. Miss Marple's suspicions were starting to take shape. Leonard, the quiet son, had clearly borne the brunt of his mother's sharp words. Had one of those cutting remarks pushed him to the edge? Was that why he seemed so distant, so emotionally detached? Or perhaps he was hiding something darker, something Miss Marple would soon uncover. Miss Marple then turned her attention to Dr. Prescott, the family physician, a man who, in Miss Marple's experience, seemed to hide more behind his professional demeanor than he let on. When she approached him about the death, his response was swift, almost too swift. "It was natural causes, Miss Marple," Dr. Prescott said, his voice too quick, too dismissive. Mrs. Strickland was of an advanced age, and her health had been failing for some time. A sudden collapse, nothing suspicious about it at all. But there was something in his tone that made Miss Marple's skin crawl. It wasn't just the matter-of-fact way he spoke. It was the urgency in his words, as if he were trying too hard to convince her, perhaps to convince himself. "Are you sure?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but carrying an unspoken weight. Dr. Prescott shifted uncomfortably, his gaze avoiding hers. "Of course, it's the most logical conclusion. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Marple, but we must accept the facts as they are." Despite his assurances, Miss Marple felt a deep unease. Could Dr. Prescott be hiding something? Or was he perhaps too eager to close the case? She couldn't shake the feeling that his dismissal of the death as natural was more than just a simple medical opinion. Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to the house, back to Mrs. Strickland's belongings. There had to be something, some clue she had missed. She spent hours combing through the house, looking for something that might shed light on the mystery. And then, in the back of Mrs. Strickland's writing desk, hidden behind a stack of old papers, she found it. A letter old, yellowed with age, and worn at the edges. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Mrs. Strickland's, but it was the words that made Miss Marple's breath catch in her throat. "I know what you did. If anything happens to me, it will be your doing." Miss Marple's mind raced. Who had Mrs. Strickland been speaking to? And what had she meant by "what you did"? The letter was a clear thread, a message left behind for someone. But who was it intended for? Was this the final warning to someone who had already gone too far? Or was it a final act of defiance, the last words of a woman who had been pushed to her limit? Was this the final warning to someone who had already gone too far? Or was it a final act of defiance, the last words of a woman who had been pushed to her limit? Miss Marple's heart pounded in her chest as she folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket. She knew this was the turning point. This letter held the key to everything. But it raised more questions than it answered. Who was the person Mrs. Strickland had warned, and why had she hidden this letter, carefully tucked away, as if it were a secret too dangerous to be known? The walls of the house seemed to close in around Miss Marple as she stepped away from the desk. The investigation had taken a darker turn. Now, more than ever, she felt the presence of someone watching her, someone who didn't want the truth to come out, and she knew that this letter, this cryptic warning, was just the beginning. Cliffhanger ending. As Miss Marple stood there, her mind racing, the soft sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. She froze. She wasn't alone. Turning slowly, she saw Leonard standing in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He took one step forward, then another, his breath shallow. "What have you found, Miss Marple?" His voice trembled. But there was something else there, something darker. Miss Marple held the letter tightly in her hand, her gaze never leaving Leonard's face. "I believe I've found something that explains more than you think, Mr. Strickland, but I'm afraid you're not going to like what comes next." The air between them crackled with tension as Leonard's gaze flickered nervously to the letter in Miss Marple's hand. "What do you mean?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. But Miss Marple didn't answer. She just watched him carefully, knowing that whatever secrets Leonard was hiding, they were about to be exposed. The midpoint. The discovery Miss Marple had been waiting for finally arrived, not with a bang, but with a quiet whisper from the past. It was in the hidden corners of Miss Strickland's home, tucked away in the back of a dusty, neglected cabinet. There, beneath a pile of forgotten letters and old receipts, Miss Marple found what would change everything. An old, leather-bound family diary. The book was aged and worn, the pages brittle, but the ink was still legible. It belonged to Mrs. Strickland's late husband, and the tone of the entries was one Miss Marple could almost feel in her bonds, the weight of something buried too deep to ever truly remain hidden. She sat down at the small desk near the window, the light barely filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. As she turned the pages, the words within them seemed to grow louder, more urgent, and then she found its single, cryptic entry that made her heart stop. "I can't let it go on like this. The blackmail has gone too far. What she has on me will ruin everything. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. She says she'll expose it all if I don't comply." Miss Marple's breath caught in her throat. Blackmail. Mrs. Strickland had been blackmailing someone. But who? And why? The name in the diary was smudged, as though the writer had hesitated to record it. It was clear someone had been under Mrs. Strickland's control for years. But why? What could this secret be that was so dangerous it could destroy lives? The clues were all there, but they led in so many directions that Miss Marple could feel herself teetering on the edge of a dangerous precipice. Miss Marple's mind raced. The blackmail wasn't just a random act of cruelty. It was personal. It was tied to something or some close to Mrs. Strickland, someone who had far more to lose than Miss Marple had initially realized. The web of deceit seemed to stretch wider with every passing moment, and the more she uncovered, the darker the picture became. Miss Marple needed answers. Who was this person being blackmailed? What could they be hiding? And why had Mrs. Strickland been so ruthless, willing to manipulate someone she knew so intimately? Her gaze flickered back to the diary, and she noticed something else, subtle but significant detail. In the very last entry, the handwriting was shakier, more frantic. It spoke of a final meeting, a confrontation that had happened just days before Mrs. Strickland's death. A meeting Miss Marple was sure had taken place in this very house. The final warning. "Tomorrow I will be done with it. No more games. She says she'll tell him everything. I don't think she will." The cryptic line hung in the air like a heavy fog. What had Mrs. Strickland meant by "done with it"? And who was he? Miss Marple's pulse quickened. She now understood that Mrs. Strickland's death wasn't an accident. It was tied to something far deeper, something far more sinister than she had originally suspected. This wasn't a simple case of a bitter, sharp-tongued old woman getting her comeuppance. No, this was about a secret so dark, so dangerous, it had led someone to murder. Miss Marple carefully closed the diary, her mind whirring with possibilities. It was clear that whoever had been blackmailed had reached their breaking point and had decided to take control. But who? The puzzle pieces were starting to come together. But the truth was still elusive, dancing just beyond her reach. Miss Marple stood, the weight of the discovery sinking in. She had more to uncover, and soon. The only question was who had been desperate enough to kill to keep their secret safe, and who among those she had spoken with could be hiding the truth. As she returned to Mrs. Strickland's study, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder now, every shift of the wind outside a potential warning. And then, just as she was about to leave the room, she noticed something that stopped her cold. A small, ornate key sitting on the desk, half hidden beneath a pile of papers. It was an old-fashioned key unlike any she had seen before. She picked it up carefully, her mind racing. Was this the key to the hidden secret? The missing piece to the puzzle that would explain everything? She had to find out. But as she turned the key over in her hand, she heard a faint sound, the unmistakable click of the door opening behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping in her chest, only to find Leonard standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something between fear and suspicion. "What are you doing here, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice too soft, too forced. "You've been in here for quite a while." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the key, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. She didn't answer immediately, studying Leonard's face for any hint of the truth. "I was just examining the room, Mr. Strickland," she said calmly, though her mind was racing. "I believe I may have found something." Leonard's eyes flickered to the key in her hand, and for a moment his expression faltered. It was almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple caught it. It was a flash of fear of guilt. "Something important?" he asked, his voice shaky. Miss Marple didn't reply. She simply slipped the key into her pocket, her gaze never leaving his face. "You might want to be careful, Mr. Strickland," she said quietly. "You never know what's hidden right under your nose." As she turned to leave, she heard Leonard's footsteps follow her down the hallway faster now, as if he were in a hurry to be rid of her. But Miss Marple knew that the discovery she had made was far from over. It had only just begun. Cliffhanger ending. As Miss Marple reached the door, she heard the faint sound of paper rustling behind her. She turned quickly, her heart pounding. Leonard had taken a step back into the study. A quick glance at the desk told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. The key was gone. It had vanished, disappeared. Leonard had taken it. "Mr. Strickland," she called, her voice sharp. "Where is it?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he walked briskly away from her, his back to her, as if he had done nothing wrong. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. What was he hiding? And what was behind that locked door? She knew she was dangerously close to the truth, but she also knew that whatever Leonard had done to get rid of the key, he was running out of time. Time was running out for all of them. The investigation deepens. Miss Marple's revelation. As Miss Marple wandered through the rooms of the Strickland house, the once comforting atmosphere now felt heavy, charged with tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind seemed to whisper secrets that had remained buried for far too long. She had been thinking about Mrs. Strickland's death, piecing together the delicate threads of her investigation. But now, something had shifted in her mind. It was no longer about a simple case of murder, no longer about a sharp-tongued woman who had simply overstayed her welcome. This was more, much more. With the discovery of the old family diary and the mention of blackmail, Miss Marple began to see the true scope of the case. The whispers in the village, the coldness between family members, the vague sense of discomfort that seemed to seep into every conversation, it all pointed to a dark, festering secret. Someone had killed Mrs. Strickland to protect something, or someone. Miss Marple stood before the grand fireplace in the sitting room, her hands clasped behind her back. The cold, flickering light from the hearth danced across the room, but it couldn't shake the chill that had settled in her bones. She thought of Leonard, whose strange emotional detachment had raised so many questions. She thought of the housekeeper, whose cryptic words had hinted at so much more than she was letting on. But most of all, she thought of the diary. It was there that the pieces began to fall into place. Mrs. Strickland had been blackmailing someone close to her. Someone who, for reasons unknown, had been forced to bear the weight of a shameful secret. The name had remained elusive in the diary, smudged, almost intentionally blurred, but Miss Marple could feel it in her gut. It was someone powerful, someone who had the means and motive to silence her forever. It wasn't just about money or greed. No, this was about something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of the Strickland family, something that had been waiting to be unearthed. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more it became clear. Mrs. Strickland's death wasn't an act of simple vengeance. It was a carefully calculated move. A move made to stop the truth from coming to light. Suddenly, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching the hallway, a soft shuffle, almost hesitant, yet deliberate. She straightened, her heart quickening for a moment, but she didn't turn. She had already come to know the rhythm of the house. It was Leonard. She took a step toward the door, pausing just long enough to peer through the crack. Leonard was standing by the staircase, glancing nervously toward the study door. His back was turned to her, but she could see his hands trembling ever so slightly. He was hiding something. She was certain of it now. The key had disappeared, and Leonard knew more than he was letting on. There was something about the way he'd reacted when Miss Marple had found the letter in Mrs. Strickland's desk, something about the way he had stiffened when the word blackmail had crossed her lips. His nerves were betraying him. As Miss Marple quietly followed him down the corridor, her eyes caught a glint of something unusual in the dim light, a shadow, a figure, passing by the study window. Her pulse quickened. Who else was in the house? Someone else was watching. Someone who didn't want the truth to come out. Could it be the housekeeper, Dr. Prescott? Or perhaps it was someone even closer to Mrs. Strickland? Without making a sound, Miss Marple stepped back into the room, her mind racing. She needed to find out what Leonard was hiding and why he seemed to be so desperate to keep the investigation from progressing. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the desk, and in a sudden moment of clarity, she realized that she had been overlooking something. The desk, a seemingly innocuous piece of furniture, had hidden compartments. She had seen them before, tucked neatly behind the drawers, but never thought to investigate. Now she felt an undeniable pull to search deeper. Could it hold the answers she was desperately seeking? As she lifted the top drawer with careful precision, a piece of paper unfolded, stained with age, caught her eye. It was another letter, but this one was different. It was not from Mrs. Strickland's hand. No, it was from someone else, a man. The words were terse, written in hurried, slanted script. "You will not speak of this. You will stop digging, or there will be consequences. You know too much now. There is no going back." Her breath hitched. This was it. The letter she had been waiting for, the final clue to understanding who had wanted to keep the Strickland family secret buried. Someone had not just wanted Mrs. Strickland's silence, they had been protecting something far darker, something much bigger than the old woman's sharp words and petty grudges. Miss Marple's mind raced with possibilities. She had come this far, but now she realized the stakes were higher than ever. She could feel the danger pressing in, surrounding her from every side. Whoever had killed Mrs. Strickland wasn't afraid to strike again to keep their secret safe. Just as she stood, carefully holding the letter in her hand, a sound shattered the silence, a loud thud from behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but saw nothing. And then, as if the house itself were conspiring against her, the door slammed shut. A bolt of terror shot through her, and she was plunged into complete darkness. For a long moment, Miss Marple stood frozen, trying to steady her breath. What was happening? Was someone trying to trap her? But she couldn't waste time. She had to act. She had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Cliffhanger ending. A sudden voice from the darkness stopped her cold. It was Leonard, his voice shaking, strained. "You're too close, Miss Marple. You don't understand. You'll never be able to solve this. It's already over." Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind working at lightning speed. She wasn't about to back down now. Not when she was so close. "I'm not afraid of the truth, Mr. Strickland," she said, her voice steady, though her pulse raced in her ears. "And neither are you." But just as she spoke, a loud crash echoed through the hallway. Someone was coming. Someone who would stop at nothing to ensure the truth stayed hidden. Miss Marple's heart pounded. The game had changed. The danger was real now. And the truth? It was just within her grasp. The final act. As the mystery surrounding Mrs. Strickland's death continued to unfold, the house seemed to grow darker with each passing hour. The walls, once silent, now whispered secrets that had been hidden for years, secrets that no one had dared to bring to the surface, until now. Miss Marple's sharp mind had pieced together most of the puzzle, but there was still something missing, something crucial that had been overlooked. That is, until an unexpected visitor arrived. It was a person who had long been thought to have disappeared from the Strickland family's life, a figure from Mrs. Strickland's past, who had been believed to have moved away years ago, never to return. But fate had a different plan. The doorbell rang one late evening, and when the door opened, it revealed the one person Miss Marple had not accounted for in her investigation. Sarah Wilding, Mrs. Strickland's estranged niece. Sarah, pale and gaunt, stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She had returned to the house after years of silence, and her arrival seemed to send a ripple of unease through the very fabric of the Strickland family. Leonard, upon seeing her, stiffened, his face pale. The housekeeper's hands trembled, and even Dr. Prescott seemed momentarily shaken. It was clear that Sarah's return was no mere coincidence. Miss Marple's instincts flared. She had suspected that there was more to the Strickland family than met the eye, but now she knew this was the final piece of the puzzle. Sarah had been involved in something far deeper, something that had tied her to Mrs. Strickland's dark past. But what? And why had she stayed away for so long? As Sarah entered the house, Miss Marple took her time observing her every movement. She was clearly troubled, her eyes darting nervously around the familiar, yet foreign, surroundings. Her presence was unsettling, and it was clear she had a deep connection to the family's secrets that had remained buried for too long. Miss Marple wasted no time. She approached Sarah in the sitting room, where the tension in the air was palpable. Sarah's hands clutched the edges of her coat tightly, as though she were trying to hold on to something fragile, something precious. Miss Marple didn't waste words. "You've come back for a reason, haven't you, Miss Wilding?" she asked softly, her voice calm yet laced with the sharpness of experience. "You've come back for a reason, haven't you, Miss Wilding?" she asked softly, her voice calm yet laced with the sharpness of experience. Sarah's eyes flickered nervously. I had no choice. I had to come back." Miss Marple leaned in, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "What happened? What are you hiding?" Sarah swallowed hard, her lips trembling. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. "It's about the treasure, the family treasure. My aunt, she was obsessed with it. It's been hidden for years, and it's the reason for all the secrets, the blackmail, the threats. All of it was to protect what she had found." Miss Marple's heart raced. A hidden family treasure. Could this be the key to everything? Mrs. Strickland's death was no longer just a simple act of murder. It was the final step in a much larger, far more dangerous game. Sarah continued, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth she had carried for so long. "The treasure is real, Miss Marple. It's not some myth. It was hidden by my grandfather, a long time ago. And my aunt, she discovered it. She knew where it was, and she used it to control people. She threatened anyone who got too close to the truth. But she couldn't stop what was coming. The treasure. It's more than just money or jewels. It's power. And it's cursed." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. A cursed treasure. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but there were still so many questions. Why had Mrs. Strickland kept this treasure a secret for so long? Who had killed her and why? Suddenly, a sharp noise interrupted their conversation, the sound of something heavy falling to the floor. Miss Marple turned quickly, her eyes scanning the room. Something was wrong. There, by the fireplace, was an envelope. It had fallen from the old leather-bound book that Mrs. Strickland had kept hidden away for years, the book Miss Marple had examined earlier in the investigation. Without thinking, Miss Marple moved toward the envelope. It was old, yellowed with age, but the seal was still intact. With a steady hand, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The words were hastily written, but they were clear. The letter was dated years ago, and it contained shocking details about the hidden treasure that had been the center of Mrs. Strickland's power. It was not just money or jewels that had been hidden, it was a map that led to something far more valuable and dangerous. and it was in the hands of someone who had killed to keep it hidden. The letter spoke of a secret room within the Strickland house, a room that had been sealed off for decades. The treasure had been locked away there, and anyone who had come close to discovering it had been silenced by Mrs. Strickland's threats, her manipulation, and eventually by death. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she processed the implications of the letter. She had always suspected there was more to this case than met the eye, but now she knew Mrs. Strickland's death had been the result of a desperate bid to protect this treasure. But why was it worth killing for? Just as Miss Marple was about to share her discovery with Sarah, a loud crash echoed through the house. The sound of breaking glass followed by hurried footsteps made her heart race. Someone else was here, someone who had been listening to their conversation. Miss Marple's instincts screamed that time was running out. The killer was still in the house, and they would stop at nothing to protect the treasure. Cliffhanger ending. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Leonard appeared in the doorway. His face twisted with panic. "You have to stop, Miss Marple. It's too dangerous. You don't know what you're dealing with. They'll kill you too." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Who, Leonard? Who is they?" Before Leonard could answer, a shadow moved behind him, too fast, too silent. A figure stepped into the room, their face hidden by a hood, and the sound of a gun being cocked echoed in the silence. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The last thing she saw before the door slammed shut was Leonard's terrified face and the figure advancing toward her, determined to stop her investigation, once and for all. Who was the true mastermind behind Mrs. Strickland's death? Would Miss Marple be able to unravel the mystery before it was too late? The clock was ticking. The game had changed. Miss Marple's quiet revelation, gripping suspense. The quiet hours of the evening had fallen over the Strickland house, and Miss Marple, as always, had settled into her corner by the window, observing the family members like a quiet, steady observer of the shifting tides of fate. The house, with its hollowed, echoing rooms and thick, heavy air, seemed to pulse with secrets, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing. Each small gesture, each nervous glance, was a clue waiting to be uncovered. There was one person who had caught her eye's quiet, unassuming figure in the background of the family's gatherings. Edward Strickland, Mrs. Strickland's reclusive nephew. He had been largely ignored by the family and the household staff, his presence barely noted, a shadow in the corners. At first, Miss Marple had thought little of him, just another relative, who seemed content to keep his distance. But there was something in his eyes, something in the way he always lingered at the edges of conversations, watching, listening, never quite joining in. It was that faint spark of interest that led Miss Marple to observe him more closely. She had seen him in the garden one afternoon, standing near the old garden shed, his back to her, staring at something intently. The way his hands gripped the weathered wood of the doorframe suggested tension, as if he were about to turn around and run. But something held him in place, something he feared more than being seen. The next evening, Miss Marple casually approached him, her voice soft and inviting, her presence calm and non-threatening. Edward's nervous reaction was telling a sharp intake of breath, a visible stiffening of his posture. He was hiding something. She could feel it in the air. "Mr. Strickland," she began, her tone casual but piercing. "I've been meaning to ask you if you ever noticed anything unusual about your aunt's affairs. Something out of the ordinary." Edward's face went pale at the mention of his aunt, his eyes darting around nervously, but he quickly masked his fear with a forced smile. "No, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a little too steady. "I've been away for years. I never really. I didn't have the chance to pay much attention." But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. His words didn't match the unease in his eyes. There was more to his reluctance than mere indifference. She knew it. She had seen enough in her time to recognize the signs of a guilty conscience. Later that evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Miss Marple found herself wandering the house once more. She passed through the narrow corridor and paused outside Edward's room. Through the thin crack of the door, she heard soft, muffled voices. Someone was inside, speaking in hushed tones, Edward's voice, accompanied by another, more urgent and demanding. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but she kept herself composed. She had to know what was going on. Carefully, she leaned in closer, straining to catch the words. The conversation was low and indistinct, but one thing became clear. Edward was being pressured, threatened even. The other voice, an unfamiliar one, spoke of things Miss Marple could not yet understand, but it was clear that this hidden figure knew more about the Strickland family secrets than anyone had realized. With careful precision, Miss Marple backed away from the door and waited until the voices stopped. Moments later, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving swiftly down the corridor, the faint scrape of shoes against the floor. Whoever had been in there was gone. It was then that Miss Marple knew Edward was hiding something far darker than anyone had imagined. He wasn't just a shy, withdrawn nephew. He was someone who had been living under the constant threat of exposure, someone who would do anything to protect a long-buried family secret. The next morning, Miss Marple's suspicions were confirmed. She found a small, crumpled letter hidden in the corner of a desk drawer that had clearly been carelessly discarded. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the ink smudged in places, as though the writer had been in a rush to send it but hadn't wanted to leave any trace. The letter was addressed to Edward Strickland, though it was not signed. The contents were chilling. "I know what you've been hiding. If you want to keep your secret safe, you will do as I say. No one must find out what really happened to your father. Not your aunt, not your family. If you don't cooperate, I will expose everything, and the consequences will be dire. Remember, some things are worth killing for." The words sent a shock through Miss Marple. Edward's father, what was the secret? What had happened to him? And what connection did it have to Mrs. Strickland's death? Miss Marple understood now. Edward's past, his family's history, and the dark undercurrent that ran through their lives were more entwined than anyone had known. Edward's fear was not only of the law or his family, was of someone who had already demonstrated they were willing to kill to keep a secret buried. Miss Marple knew she had to act quickly. The longer this secret remained hidden, the more dangerous it became. Someone had already killed once, and they would not hesitate to do it again if their secret was at risk. She had only one option left: confront Edward before it was too late. But when she arrived at his room, the door was ajar, and the room was empty, gone without a trace. Panic stirred within her chest. Had he run? Or had something far more sinister happened? Cliffhanger ending. As Miss Marple stood in the empty room, her mind racing with possibilities, a sudden noise behind her made her whip around. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway. It was Edward, but he looked different, his eyes wild, his face pale. In his trembling hands, he held something family heirloom, an ancient gleaming key. I can't let you go any further, Miss Marple," he whispered, his voice strained with fear. "If you do, it'll be the end of us all." And with that, the door slammed shut behind him, leaving Miss Marple standing alone in the darkened room, the mystery deepening around her. Would she be able to unlock the secret in time, or would the Strickland family's buried past claim another victim? The answers were just within reach, but not without great risk. The clock was ticking, and Miss Marple knew that someone was desperate to ensure that some truths never saw the light of day. The climax. The dimly lit drawing room of Mrs. Strickland's grand house felt colder now, its once regal warmth replaced by an air of suspicion and tension. The heavy curtains were drawn, blocking out the afternoon sun, leaving the room in an eerie twilight. Miss Marple stood by the fireplace, her calm gaze sweeping over the gathered guests. The old clock on the mantel ticked loudly, each second amplifying the stillness in the room. It was a moment of reckoning, one that Miss Marple had known was inevitable. Seated before her were the suspects, the members of the Strickland family, and those closest to the late Mrs. Strickland. They were all here, each wearing the mask of innocence, yet Miss Marple could see the telltale signs of guilt beneath their surfaces. She had observed them closely over the past days, and now the truth was about to come to light. "Let's begin, shall we?" Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady but carrying the weight of certainty. "We've all been circling around the same questions, but as with all mysteries, the truth is simpler than we imagine. The answer lies not in complex motives or elusive clues, but in a single undeniable fact. Mrs. Strickland's death was not a random act of violence, it was a carefully planned execution of a long-standing grudge. She paused, her eyes gliding from one suspect to the next. But why now? Why kill her now, after all these years? The room fell silent. The faces before her were a mixture of unease and confusion. Each one seemed to be waiting for someone else to crack, to reveal their secret. It was Edward Strickland, standing rigid at the back of the room, who broke the silence. His face was pale, his lips pressed tightly together. His hands trembled ever so slightly, betraying the composure he tried so hard to maintain. He had been quiet throughout the investigation, but now, as Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, a flicker of panic crossed his eyes. "Edward," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm, yet sharp like a blade, "you are the one who held the key to this mystery all along. Your aunt's death was not about money, nor was it about her meddling in family affairs. It was about an old wound that had been festering for years." The air seemed to tighten, and the breath of the gathered crowd caught in their throats. Miss Marple turned her attention to the others in the room: Leonard, the distant son, and Dr. Prescott, the family physician. Both appeared unnerved, their eyes darting to one another, but neither spoke. With an almost imperceptible smile, Miss Marple continued, "Mrs. Strickland was blackmailing someone who feared that their secret would be exposed, and that person, my dear friends, is none other than Dr. Prescott." Gasps filled the room as Dr. Prescott recoiled in horror. His face drained of color, and his hand shot out to steady himself against the arm of his chair. "Me?" he stammered, his voice quivering. "That's impossible. What could I have to hide?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet triumph. "You see, Dr. Prescott, your professional reputation, your career is what was at stake. But it was not just any mistake, was it? It was a mistake that involved Mrs. Strickland's husband, the very man who was once your patient. A man whose death was, I suspect, not entirely natural." Dr. Prescott's lips trembled as his gaze dropped to the floor. His entire body was rigid, but Miss Marple could see the guilt, the shame, written plainly in his features. The room was silent, waiting for him to deny the accusation. But he didn't. Instead, his voice cracked with confession. "It was an accident," he whispered hoarsely. I had been treating Mr. Strickland for months, but I made a grave error. He had a condition I didn't catch in time. I thought I could cover it up quietly. I thought I could erase the mistake. But then she found out. Mrs. Strickland, she always had a way of getting to the truth. She threatened me, and when I refused to comply with her demands, she began to manipulate me. She blackmailed me with what I had done." The confession hung in the air like a heavy fog. The truth was out now, but the full picture had yet to be revealed. "Edward," Miss Marple said, turning slowly to face him again, "you have been protecting your uncle's murderer all along, haven't you? You knew, and you let him get away with it. The pressure, the threat to your family's reputation was too great for you to resist. You never could allow anyone to find out what really happened to your father. And when Mrs. Strickland started digging into your family's secrets, she had to be silenced." Edward's face twisted in anguish, the weight of guilt crushing him. He looked at his hands as though they were the hands of a stranger, as if he could not reconcile the man in front of him with the actions he had taken. "Miss Marple, I didn't know what to do," he muttered. "My father's legacy, my family, it was all at risk. She would have ruined everything. I thought I was doing the right thing. But now, I realize what I've done." Miss Marple's gaze softened for a brief moment, though her voice remained steady. "In our darkest moments, we make choices that haunt us. But it is never too late to face the truth." As the confession resonated through the room, Miss Marple paused, allowing the weight of the revelation to settle over the family. The Strickland house was no longer a place of power or privilege. It had become the backdrop for a tragic unraveling. Cliffhanger ending. But just as the finality of the moment settled, a sudden sound cut through the tension: the sharp, distinct ring of the doorbell. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. There was no more time for pondering what had happened. Whoever was at the door had come for a reason, and Miss Marple knew that no mystery ever truly ended with a neat bow. There was always more to uncover, always more to reveal. The room held its breath, and Miss Marple, unfazed, nodded to the butler standing in the doorway. "Please, let them in," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes gleaming with the knowledge that another revelation was coming. As the door creaked open, everyone in the room turned to face the newcomer. Would this person hold the key to yet another dark secret? Or was this just the beginning of another tale of deception, revenge, and betrayal? The clock ticked on, and the mystery of Mrs. Strickland's death was far from over.